to see you.
Right, good.
Okay. But thank you very much for your time, Lord Turner, and for speaking with us about your excellent book, Between Debt and the Devil, exactly, which came out here in the UK in November, and now slowly spreading across the world. You took over as head of the Financial Service Authorities 5 days after the Lehman Brothers crash. Do you consider that good timing or bad timing?
Well, it was bad timing in the sense of it's rather like being appointed captain of the Titanic after you've hit the iceberg but before you've actually sunk. It means that I can truly say, I was not in charge when the things went wrong, but I immediately also say that I recognise entirely that if I had been there back in 2006, 7, earlier 2008, I think I would have made exactly the same mistakes that other people who were in the regulatory community, the central bank community, the Ministry of Finance community made. Because I think there was a giant failure to see that crisis coming. And I'm afraid that although I was, as it were, a private individual rather than a public official at that time, I also did not see that crisis coming. And part of the reason why I wrote the book was a reflection on what was wrong with modern economics, what was wrong with our way of thinking about the world, that there was such a across-the-board failure, apart from one or two people who were treated as mavericks, but otherwise, within the conventional policy orthodoxy, a real failure to see that crisis coming.
And why was that?
I think we had developed over the years, increasingly from about the 1970s onwards, a way of thinking about the macroeconomy which bluntly ignored a lot of the details of the financial system. Central bank orthodoxy had gravitated to the belief that as long as we had low and stable inflation, everything would be well with the world. And there was a very dominant strain of modern economics based on what's called the rational expectations hypothesis and the efficient market hypothesis, which assumed that as long as you left things to a free market, it was bound to make rational, efficient and useful decisions.
Did you used to believe that?
I never really believed the efficient market hypothesis nor the rational expectation hypothesis. And indeed, I wrote another book about 15 years ago called Just Capital, the Liberal Economy, in which I expressed doubts about that. But although I did doubt the efficient market hypothesis, although I knew, for instance, that equity markets could do crazy things in the NASDAQ boom, grow to absurdly high levels and crash, what I didn't realise was that this could produce an enormous crisis in the guts of the financial system. And the bit which I had not concentrated on, really I think since I did undergraduate economics, and then I think I'd forgotten it, was the way that the banking system creates credit and money and purchasing power and can overcreate credit and money, and the way that cycles of credit and real estate lending in particular and asset prices can produce disaster. I, for instance, had not read Hyman Minsky. Hyman Minsky, who I think was seen as a maverick economist, completely outside the mainstream, was a name which I didn't even know about till autumn 2008, when, like other people, I was sort of looking around saying, well, how do we explain this enormous event? And I found that there was a person who had been completely ignored and, in a sense, disparaged by the dominant orthodoxy of economics. So although I saw some problems with the orthodoxy, I don't think I really understood the most central thing which was wrong, which was a failure to understand the nature of banking.
So there's a lot of popular culture around at the moment about greedy bankers. You can go to any cinema here in London and see The Big Short, etc. And we in the media love to write about bonuses, etc., etc. But you have a chapter in your book called Irrelevant Bankers, or something like that. Were the bankers really irrelevant to the crisis?
The chapter is called Irrelevant Bankers in an Unstable System. And I make the point that if you read really good, thoughtful accounts of the economic crash of 1929 to 33, I'm thinking, for instance, of a book like Lords of Finance, you will find that it focuses almost entirely on the policy mistakes that went wrong. Now, were there in the late 20s people who did terrible scams? Of course there were. Were there bankers who acted in a completely irresponsible fashion and lent money in a crazy risky fashion in 27, 28, 29 in America? Yes, of course they were. But in a thoughtful account of why did the world face an enormous financial crisis in 1929 to 33, all those scams and incompetence, they're just footnotes. Now, I want to be clear. Yes, I think there was harm done by some terrible immoral behavior. I think there was harm done by poor incentives that allowed people to make large amounts of money and then, get out the way before the crisis occurred and leave it to other people to pick up. Yes, I think that we need to require the boards of the banks to really focus on the quality of their underlying business. But at the end of the day, what I argue is all that is less important than the design of the overall system. How much capital we have in the banking system, how much liquidity we have in the banking system, how we try to control the total level of leverage in the economy. So the chapter title, Irrelevant Bankers in an Unstable System, is a bit of an overstatement. It's a deliberate provocation. They're not entirely irrelevant, but they're nothing like as important as the failures of public policy.
So this message must be a bit of a hard sell, that it's not mainly the evil bankers and evil hedge funders who are here around us in Mayfair here in central London that were to blame for the crisis, but actually people like you and me with mortgages that we pay back very diligently.
I think
on an aggregated level.
Yes, and I think this is one of the great challenges in economics, is to understand the aggregate total impact of behaviours which looked at individually are entirely rational and entirely responsible. So when people think of good lending by a banker, they think, well, it's good to lend money to the ordinary citizen who wants to buy a house, to have a family house. But if that is done on too large a scale, if lots of people simultaneously are across the world doing that and driving an increase in property prices, which then requires the next generation to borrow even more money in order to be able to afford a house because the price of the houses has gone up in value, then when there's a crack of confidence, the aggregate attempt of all those people who suddenly feel that they are overborrowed and they cut their consumption in order to pay back their debt can drive the economy into recession. And here's the real irony. The biggest harm may be done by a whole load of debts that do get repaid, right? So bankers can make loans which get repaid by householders, and we say, well, that must have been good lending. The lending was repaid. But if the aggregate impact of all those people desperately trying to repay their loans, it's that can drive the economy into recession. There's a brilliant book by Atif Mian and Amir Sufi, House of Debt, which describes exactly how that process worked in the US economy in 2009.
Because we're so diligently paying back our loans that we don't consume.
That we don't consume, yes. Yeah. That basically, if the level of lending goes to too high a level, even if people do pay back the debts, the attempt to pay back the debts or the actual success of paying back the debts drives the economy into the debt overhang, recession and malaise, which is where we've really been stuck for the last 7 or 8 years.
So would you say that policymakers focus too much on Basel III, which you were involved in, and we in the media focus too much on bonuses, and that's been part of the problem?
Look, I spent 4 years of my life as the chairman of the major policy committee of the International Financial Stability Board. I spent hours, weeks, months of my time debating Basel III, higher capital standards. I was a hawk on capital standards. I was a hawk on what we should do on remuneration and bankers' bonuses, etc. And I think, the totality of the reforms we did were good and worthwhile. Within those, I think the extra capital requirements were far more important than the things on bankers' bonuses. And I don't think those capital requirement increases that we did were nearly as radical as we should ideally do. And in the book, I argue that in an ideal world, we would have bank capital requirements which are, at least twice as high, even as the level that we got them up to in Basel III. So,
because what should be done? Should banks be abolished?
Well, this is, of course, the one of the great interesting issues, which I also discuss in one of the chapters of the books. Should we abolish banks? I mean, people
because
say,
if good lending can be bad.
People say that sounds unbelievably radical. But what is interesting is there were a group of economists in the 1930s, and they were economists who in every other aspect of their economic theory were very much capitalists, very much free marketeers, believed in free competition. This is people like Irving Fisher, Frank Knight, Henry Simons. And they proposed in a letter and a proposal to President Roosevelt that the crucial thing was to abolish banks. Abolish what's called fractional reserve banks that can take your money and only keep a little bit of that in reserve and lend out the rest. Because they argued that the process of fractional reserve banks creating new credit and money that didn't exist was always bound to be so unstable that it would end in a disaster, such as the disaster of 1929. Now, actually in the book, I don't go that far.
No, not
there
quite
are
that
some people who are suggesting that going that far. I don't go that far because I think there is a role for debt in the economy. I'm not a sort of absolutist here. I'm not taking a sort of Islamic finance point of view, though I do respect that point of view. I'm not taking a point of view that we can do without debt contracts. I think there is a role for a mortgage market, for instance, to lubricate the exchange of the ownership of assets between generations, between people. But I simply think we need to constrain and control this credit and money creation process far more strongly than we did in the past.
So what should policymakers do with this, the problem of housing and debt? There's a housing bubble in Sweden at the moment. Many people argue. At the same time, the Swedish government is very proud of, sort of good public finances. But you argue in the book, as many other people do, that the amount of debt is always the same. It can be public or it can be private, kind of squeezed around. What should policymakers do about housing bubbles?
Well, Sweden is a very interesting point. I mean, Sweden has, and it's intriguing that this occurs even in a quite, a very lightly populated country, that there's a huge tendency of people to want property very specifically in the middle of Stockholm and one or two other major locations. And I think what's occurred there illustrates that you cannot control those bubbles simply by increasing the interest rates. That's what the Riksbank tried to do in 2011, 2012, increasing the interest rate against the trend of central banks. And actually it had almost no impact at all on the credit and housing market boom, but it put the rest of the economy, slowed down the rest of the economy. So I think we have to have what are called strong macroprudential levers. We have to have higher capital in the banking system, but also counter-cyclical capital, where when we see these credit and asset price bubbles developing, we demand higher capital from the banks, but higher capital in particular against lending to real estate. I don't think the central bank or the regulator should get into the details of precise loan allocation. They should not be involved in saying, well, this industry needs a bit more loans and this bit less. But I think they have to recognize that there is a naturally arising tendency for the banking system left to itself to gravitate to even more real estate lending than is valuable. And I think regulation has to lean the other way. For instance, one thing I would not do, I don't think we should allow the risk weights for real estate to be set by what are called private internal risk based analysis. I think seen from the point of view of banks, real estate lending will look like and often is the least risky thing for them to do, but it has an adverse social externality effect. It has an adverse effect on the macroeconomy, which can never be seen from the point of view of the private bank. So I think we should not allow mortgages to have risk weights of 20%. I think we should set minimum risk weights for mortgages which are much higher than that.
But is there any way back from this world of high debt? I mean, private credit has grown from 50% of GDP in advanced economies in 1950 to 170% in 2007. Can we ever turn back from this?
That is a really interesting question. I mean, I think there are two interesting questions about the growth of credit. As you say, went from 50% debt to GDP in the advanced economies on average in 1950 to 170% in 2007, and it increases pretty much every year from 1950 to 2007. And once we've got that debt, we never really get rid of it. We simply shift it around the economy from the private to the public sector or back to the private sector again. I think there are two questions that arise from that. First of all, is it possible to run an advanced capitalist economy with a level of debt growth which is in line with GDP growth rather than faster? So for about 20 years before the crisis, the sort of rough pattern, the average pattern of the advanced economies is that nominal income, nominal GDP, grew at about 5% per annum, and nominal credit grew at about 10 to 15% per annum. And it seemed at the time that we needed that nominal credit growth in order to achieve adequate growth in nominal GDP. But if that is the case, the system will eventually blow up. Now, I argue in the book that yes, we can grow modern economies in a way where, let's say, credit only grows at 5%, roughly in line with nominal GDP growth of 5%. But I think we need to make some major changes. I think we need to deal with problems of rising inequality. I think we need to constrain the tendency to overlend against real estate. I think we need to deal with the problems of global imbalances. And there are some of those things which you can't deal with just by telling the regulator to do something different. There are a wider set of social choices that need to be made. But I think we also need a radically changed approach to financial regulation. Then, of course, there's the completely separate problem of, well, we didn't do all that back in 1970, 80, 90. We've got all this debt. What are we going to do about it?
Yes.
And the point I make in the book is we're not going to get out of that just by quantitative easing and negative interest rates. Negative interest rates are a good way to make existing debt seem affordable, but they can only do that by making it also look attractive to take on new debt so that we never get out of this debt overhang. I think we're going to have to end up with far more radical policies across the world to get out of this trap.
So you do believe that we need to turn back to higher interest rates, and that the way to do this is basically for central banks to print physical money and throw them out from helicopters, right?
Well, I don't really call it printing money and dropping it from a helicopter. That is the analogy which Milton Friedman, and let's remember this is Milton Friedman. He's not normally known as a sort of mad left-wing socialist inflation lover. It is Milton Friedman who very clearly said, if you are in a situation where there is a lack of nominal demand, you're stuck in a deflationary trap, then you always could fill a helicopter with money, scatter the notes down, and it will get the economy going again. Now, the real world implication of that is that faced with too much debt in the world and faced with an environment where all our other policy levers look blocked, what we can do is run higher fiscal deficits, which means either more public expenditure or lower taxes, financed for a period of time and under a constrained amount with permanent central bank money creation. And that, I believe, is a tool which would undoubtedly stimulate nominal growth. It would undoubtedly increase the inflation rates back to the sort of targets of 2% that we believe are appropriate. I think in technical terms, there is no doubt whatsoever that it is possible. And there is no doubt whatsoever in technical terms that if you do a small amount of it, you'll have a small effect. If you have a huge amount, you'll have a hyperinflationary effect. It's calibratable. You can work out how much you want. The only issue, but it's a very, very important issue, is the political risk. Because the way that we've proceeded with money finance for the last 50 years or more is to say, this is so dangerous. This is like an alcoholic who can't trust themselves to have one glass of wine. If we allow ourselves to do it a bit, we'll want to do it again and again and again. So what we've got to find, and what we've got to convince ourselves is are there ways of setting up a set of political rules and responsibilities so that we can use this undoubtedly feasible tool in a constrained and disciplined fashion.
I mean, there are cases, I mean, Zimbabwe people must bring up all the time where this didn't exactly go to plan, or, I mean, the Germans, the Weimar Republic.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's absolutely clear, and that is why there is a logic that we have created a taboo against money finance. We've treated it as a medicine which taken in small quantities would be good for us, but taken in large quantities is fatal. And we've said we don't trust ourselves to do it in small quantities, so let's lock it in the medicine cabinet and throw away the key. But if we are in an environment where all the other tools are ineffective or actually have adverse side effects on inequality, on financial instability, on creating yet more debt, then I think we've got to at least debate, can we trust ourselves to use that medicine in a disciplined and small fashion rather than an excessive fashion? And I argue that if we clearly gave to independent inflation targeting central banks the authority to decide how much of this medicine is appropriate and no more, then we could use it in a disciplined rather than an undisciplined fashion.
Because the difference between quantitative easing as it's sort of become today and this is actually not that huge.
The difference between quantitative easing and what I am suggesting here is permanence.
Yeah.
At the moment, let's take Japan. The Japanese central bank, the Bank of Japan, now owns government debt equal to about 70% of Japanese GDP. And that is out of what the IMF calls the net debt of the Japanese state of about 150% of GDP. So about a half of the net debt is owned by the Bank of Japan. And right at the moment, that debt isn't costing any interest to the Bank of Japan because it's essentially financed by, to the government of Japan because it's essentially financed by the Bank of Japan, which creates money which is zero interest. But at the moment, the Bank of Japan says it will sell that back to the private market. So when the Japanese people are told what their debt level is, they're told that it's 150%, 250% gross, 150% net, even though of that 150, 70, 75 is owned by the Bank of Japan. And because they're told that they owe all of this money, they're told you're going to have fiscal austerity. We're going to have a sales tax increase in April 2017 to deal with this debt burden. Now, if you came along and said, well, hang on, no, this debt doesn't exist, right? The government owes it to the Bank of Japan, but the government owns the Bank of Japan, so on a consolidated basis it isn't there. That would change the forward-looking fiscal constraint. That would enable the Japanese government to say, no, we don't need that sales tax increase, and that would change behaviour. So I think there is an important difference between QE and permanent overt money finance. What some people point out, and is absolutely right, is if QE turns out to be permanent, i.e. if in 30 years' time, every year we've said, no, this is temporary, but it turns out to be permanent, then the difference between QE and overt money finance will post facto be less than it initially seems.
So do you tell George Osborne, the Chancellor of Britain, this?
Well, I think George is well aware of my opinion. Look, I think that it's very, very difficult for people who are doing a job like finance minister or governor of a central bank to break out of the dominant orthodoxy. And if I had been appointed governor of the Bank of England in 2013, and it's well known that I was a candidate and I'd have liked to have done it, I doubt if I could have said this, right? Because I would have been worried that by saying it, it would scare the markets, scare the foreign exchanges. So I don't think you should disparage people who are trying to do a good job within the constraints of the existing orthodoxy. But I think there is a valuable role for somebody who is not doing one of those jobs to say, no, hang on, if you step back, we are going to have to think about more radical policies. And I think those different roles in public life between the people doing the day-to-day jobs who will always find it very difficult to break outside the orthodoxy because there's all sorts of constraints of a 24-hour news cycle in the financial markets. So you shouldn't disparage what they're doing, but there's also hopefully a useful role of saying, we're going to have to think about this, because I think we are in such a deep economic malaise, stuck with this debt overhang, that I think we are eventually going to do money-financed fiscal deficits. And I think the real choice is whether we debate the theory, get the theory right, and do it in a disciplined fashion within a well-defined set of rules or responsibilities, or whether this is ultimately done by populist governments responding to the fact that capitalism is no longer delivering, the success for ordinary people that we promised it would deliver. So I think we're going to end up with this, and the choice is whether we do it in a well-disciplined, well-thought-out fashion, or through populist governments just doing it in an indisciplined fashion.
Thank you very much for speaking with us, Lord Turner, about your excellent book, Between Debt and the Devil, which came out here in Britain in November last year, and which is slowly spreading across the world with its quite radical message.
Thank you.
Thank you.